Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we drift into one of the oldest questions any society has ever asked. What does fairness look like once people must live, work, trade, own, compete, and depend on one another? Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys, please follow SleepWise and share it with someone whose mind stays awake a little longer than it should. Our story tonight is not a debate. It is a slower walk through the search for balance between freedom and security, ambition and protection, reward and obligation. Long before people argued over capitalism or socialism, they were already struggling with the older problem beneath both words. Some worked from sunrise until night and remained poor, while others inherited land, grain, power, or rights that seemed fixed. In ancient kingdoms, villages, and port cities, most people did not ask whether markets should be free or industry publicly owned. They asked simpler questions. Who eats, who owns, who decides, and who is sheltered when harvests fail? For most of human history, fairness was not a theory. It was the difference between bread and hunger, rent and eviction, a warm room or a winter floor. People kept imagining better arrangements. Priests spoke of justice. Philosophers wrote of virtue. Rulers promised order. Merchants promised abundance. And rebels promised a world in which burdens might be shared more evenly. As trade expanded, as cities grew, and as machines later transformed whole landscapes, the question became sharper. New fortunes appeared. Old hierarchies were shaken, but inequality did not disappear. It simply changed its shape. That is why this episode is not only about systems, it is about the hope that prosperity might be joined with dignity. Some believed the answer would come from markets, from exchange, competition, invention, and the freedom to build. Others believed that fairness required collective power and stronger guarantees. History, as we will see, was rarely tidy enough to confirm either dream in pure form. Societies borrowed, corrected, improvised, and blended because real life kept resisting clean designs. So tonight, we begin before the arguments hardened into ideology, before banners and manifestos, before the Cold War turned economics into identity. We begin with ordinary people and the quiet realization that every society must answer the same enduring question, not simply how to grow wealth, but how to live with one another once that wealth exists, once it is unevenly held, and once people begin comparing what they give to what they receive. The world slows, and so do we. And in that slower light, we can see that capitalism and socialism were never just theories in books. They were two attempts to answer an older human longing, the longing to build a world that feels, if never perfectly fair, then at least less needlessly unjust. To understand the arguments that would come later, we first have to enter the older world that came before them, a world in which most people were not workers in factories or voters in modern states, but peasants, tenants, servants, laborers, and subjects. In much of medieval Europe, land was the great source of wealth, A king might claim a realm, nobles might control vast estates, and families at the bottom often worked soil they would never own, handing over rent, labor, or crops in exchange for protection and permission to remain. This arrangement is often called feudalism, though real life was messier than the tidy diagrams in textbooks. In practice, it meant that status was largely inherited, mobility was limited, and economic life was tied to land, custom, and obligation more than open choice. A village did not wake each morning and ask what the market demanded. It followed seasons, rents, church calendars, local rights, and the authority of landlords whose claims were backed by law and habit. In France, England, and much of Central Europe, peasants owed dues in grain, labor, or coin. In the Russian Empire, serfdom endured into the 19th century, binding millions of people to estates and limiting freedom of movement. Cities offered something different, though not always something fairer. In towns and trading centers, guilds controlled entry into crafts, set quality rules, and protected their members, creating stability that also kept outsiders at a distance. The baker, the blacksmith, the weaver, the mason, each often belonged to a regulated order. These institutions preserved skill and continuity, yet they also reminded people that economic life had long been shaped by gatekeepers. Beyond Europe, other systems mixed hierarchy, trade, tribute, and imperial administration in their own ways. In the Ottoman world, Mughal India, and Qing China, markets could be vibrant, but political power still rested heavily on empire, tax systems, landholding, and official rank. For most ordinary people, the question was not whether society should maximize innovation or guarantee equality. The question was whether taxes were bearable, whether land was secure, and whether a bad harvest would mean debt, flight, or starvation. This older world matters because both capitalism and socialism would later define themselves against it. Capitalism would promise release from inherited constraint, a world where energy, talent, and enterprise might matter more than birth. Socialism, too, would reject the old order from another direction. It would look at entrenched privilege and conclude that freedom means little when property and power are already concentrated in a few hands. And so the search for fairness did not begin with factories or manifestos. It began much earlier, wherever people noticed that some burdens seemed permanent for the many, while comfort remained reserved for the few. Over time, however, the old land-bound order began to loosen, not all at once, but through trade, money, ships, and the quiet rise of people whose power came not from ancestry alone, but from exchange. In places like Venice, Amsterdam, and later London, wealth increasingly moved along sea lanes and through counting houses. Merchants financed voyages, insurers priced risk, banks extended credit, and port cities became places where fortunes could be built through movement rather than inherited through fields. This did not create fairness overnight. Trade enriched some families spectacularly and empires often expanded through conquest, extraction, and slavery, reminding us that early commercial growth could be dynamic and brutal at the same time. Yet, something important had shifted. Wealth no longer sat only in land, titles, and harvests. It could also live in ships, warehouses, ledgers, bonds, and commercial reputation. The Dutch Republic became an early example of this new world. Its merchants, shipbuilders, and financiers helped turn a small maritime society into a commercial power, showing how finance, logistics, and trade networks could rearrange social influence. London followed with even greater scale. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, government debt markets, marine insurance at Lloyd's, and the expanding reach of the British Empire all helped create a system in which contracts and capital became more central to public life. Markets, of course, had existed for centuries, but in this period they grew denser and more essential, linking farms to ports, ports to colonies, and distant consumers to producers they would never meet. You could see the transformation in something as ordinary as sugar, tea, or cloth. Goods that once felt rare or local began moving across oceans, and with them came new habits of consumption, new fortunes, and new inequalities. In Britain, the enclosure movement added another layer to this story. Common lands that had long supported village life were gradually fenced, privatized, and reorganized, increasing efficiency for some landowners while displacing many rural families who lost access to pasture. This was one of history's recurring lessons. Systems that increase output do not always preserve belonging. What looks efficient from above can feel devastating at ground level, especially when old protections vanish before new opportunities are within reach. Still, commercial society offered a kind of possibility the older feudal world rarely had. A person with talent, credit, or luck could sometimes rise through trade, enterprise, or invention, and that possibility would become one of capitalism's deepest promises. By the 18th century, the old world of fixed hierarchy had not disappeared, but beside it stood a newer world of merchants, markets, private property, and expanding choice. And with it came new hopes and new forms of insecurity. By the 18th century, more and more thinkers were trying to understand what this newer commercial world was becoming. Among the most influential was the Scottish philosopher Adam Smith, who looked at shops, workshops, ports, and markets and asked a question that echoes now. How does a society coordinate itself when no single ruler directs every exchange? Smith is often remembered as a defender of self-interest, but his world was more morally textured than that shorthand suggests. Before he wrote about markets, he wrote about sympathy, about the human ability to imagine the feelings of others, and about the social norms that make ordinary life possible. This matters because early capitalism was not only an argument for greed. In its most persuasive form, it was an argument that voluntary exchange could produce order, abundance, and mutual benefit, without requiring a monarch to decide who should bake bread, weave cloth, or move grain from one town to another. A butcher did not provide meat because he had been commanded by a distant planner. A baker did not wake before dawn because a noble household had issued a decree. In Smith's account, people pursued their livelihoods, and through prices, competition, and exchange, goods found their way through society. This did not mean the system was perfect, or that Smith believed merchants should be trusted without restraint. He warned about collusion, monopoly, and the tendency of some business interests to bend rules in their favor. Even in the early story of markets, the danger was already visible. Private energy could create wealth, but concentrated power could distort the game. The appeal of market society was profound. Compared with rigid hereditary orders, it seemed to offer movement. Compared with economies built mainly on custom and command, it seemed adaptive. Prices could signal scarcity, profit could reward efficiency, and competition could push people to improve tools and methods. You can picture this not in formulas, but in ordinary life. A shortage of grain raised prices, encouraging more supply. A better loom allowed cloth to be made more cheaply. A trader who found a faster route or lower cost could gain customers. No king needed to orchestrate each decision. The system, at least in theory, adjusted itself. And so, one of capitalism's deepest promises came into view, that freedom in exchange might unlock creativity on a scale older societies could scarcely imagine. Yet, tucked inside that promise was a quieter question, one that history would not stop asking. If markets are good at producing wealth, who makes sure that wealth is bearable to live beside? Who protects those with little bargaining power? And what happens when freedom for the strong feels very different from freedom for the weak? The debate had not yet fully arrived, but its outline was already there, waiting in the spaces between prosperity and power. Then the machines arrived, and the rhythm of economic life changed. In 18th century Britain, changes that had been gathering slowly through commerce, finance, and private enterprise began to accelerate through industry. Water frames, spinning mules, steam engines, ironworks, and coal mines did not merely improve production, they altered the scale of what a society could make, move, and consume. Textile mills in places like Manchester and Lancashire turned raw cotton into cloth at speeds older hand spinners could never match. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine made power more useful across mines, factories, and transport. Soon, railways followed, shrinking distance and changing time itself. Coal could move farther, goods could reach new markets, and regions became more tightly connected through iron tracks, timetables, and industrial demand. The gains were extraordinary. Britain's output rose, trade expanded, and goods once considered scarce became more common. Iron, cotton cloth, and machine tools began to remake not just the economy, but the visual world. Smokestacks on horizons, warehouses by canals, and cities reshaped by industry. To many observers, this seemed like proof that market society had discovered a hidden engine of abundance. Private capital could gather resources, inventors could improve technology, entrepreneurs could build factories, and competition could push production upward. But the factory age also introduced a harsher intimacy between wealth and suffering. Rural families left villages for towns whose streets were crowded and smoky. Men, women, and children worked long hours under strict discipline, sometimes for wages that barely covered food and rent. In early mills and mines, safety was often poor. Child labor was common. In some textile districts, children as young as 8 or 9 worked long shifts tending machines. In coal mines, the work was dark, dangerous, and physically punishing. Friedrich Engels described parts of industrial Manchester as a place where prosperity and misery stood beside one another with startling closeness. That contrast would become one of the central sights of the 19th century. Enormous productive power and deep human strain. This was one of the great paradoxes of capitalism's rise. The same system that generated railways, mechanized looms, and unprecedented output also created slums, insecurity, and labor conditions many found morally intolerable. And yet people kept coming. Factories offered wages, however meager, and towns offered possibility, however uneven. The industrial world was harsh, but it was also dynamic, pulling millions into a new economic order. The world had become more productive, but not yet more gentle, and so the search for fairness entered a new phase. No longer about nobles and peasants alone, but about owners and workers, profit and labor, progress and the cost of progress. If the industrial city was where capitalism displayed its strength, it was also where its weaknesses became impossible to ignore. In places like Manchester, Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow, growth arrived with noise, smoke, crowding, and a new kind of visibility, because poverty was no longer scattered quietly across distant fields. It was packed into streets, alleyways, tenements, and factory districts, standing almost side by side with warehouses full of goods and counting houses full of profit. A visitor could walk from a prosperous commercial quarter into neighborhoods where sewage ran poorly, rooms were overcrowded, and disease moved quickly through families already weakened by labor and poor diet. In London, Paris, and the fast-growing cities of the United States, the same broad pattern appeared. Industry created jobs and drew migrants, but the speed of growth often overwhelmed housing, sanitation, and public health, leaving cities richer in output than in comfort. This was not merely a matter of low wages, it was also a matter of bargaining power, because a worker who owned no land, no tools, and no factory had very little leverage against an employer who could usually replace him or her with someone equally desperate. That imbalance shaped daily life. A bad week at the factory could mean missed rent, hunger, debt at the grocer, or children being pulled into work sooner than their parents had hoped. In the new industrial order, time itself became stricter. Bells, whistles, and shift schedules replaced older rhythms tied to season, daylight, and local custom. And for many workers, this discipline felt less like liberation than submission to a machine that never grew tired. Yet the system was doing something undeniably powerful. It was producing more cloth, more iron, more coal, more transport, and eventually more consumer goods than older economies had managed, which is why the defense of capitalism would always carry real force. Its supporters could point to rising output, expanding trade, falling costs for some goods, and the possibility that today's hardship might open tomorrow's opportunity. Its critics could point to lives that were being spent inside that transition and ask why a society that could produce so much still left so many so exposed. Out of that tension came one of the central lessons of modern economic history. Growth can increase the size of the pie, but it does not decide on its own how pain is distributed while the pie is expanding. And so the industrial city became more than a place. It became an argument, almost a living diagram of a larger question. If wealth is being created at astonishing speed, what does justice require from those who benefit most from its creation? By the middle of the 19th century, some thinkers were no longer satisfied with calls for charity, moral improvement, or gentler factory owners. They had begun to suspect that the unfairness they saw was not accidental, but built into the structure of industrial capitalism itself. Among the most influential were Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who looked at the mills, slums, and commercial streets of their age and tried to describe the deeper logic beneath them. Engels had seen industrial Manchester firsthand, and Marx, drawing on philosophy, economics, and history, argued that modern society was increasingly organized around a conflict between those who owned productive property and those who had little to sell except their labor. Their language could be sharp, but the questions were grounded in very real scenes. Why did the people whose work kept factories running remain so insecure, while owners could accumulate far more than they physically needed? Why did crises keep returning, with overproduction in one place, unmet need in another, and unemployment spreading through no obvious failure of effort among workers? Marx believed the answer lay in exploitation, by which he meant that labor created value, but much of that value was captured by owners of capital. For Marx, capitalism was dynamic precisely because it was restless. It pushed firms to invest, expand, mechanize, cut costs, and compete relentlessly, and that energy made it historically powerful, even admirable in a strange way, because it overturned old feudal stagnation and transformed production on a global scale. But he also believed that the same system was unstable. Competition pressured employers to reduce labor costs. Technology displaced workers. Profits could be squeezed, and recurring crises revealed that a market economy could be both astonishingly productive and deeply turbulent. Marx and Engels did not simply condemn inequality as unfair in a moral sense. They argued that ownership itself shaped power, and that a society could not be truly free when the majority depended on property they did not control. This is what made socialism, in its early intellectual form, feel so radical. It did not merely ask the rich to behave more kindly, It questioned whether private ownership of major productive assets should remain the organizing principle of society at all. Even those who rejected Marx's conclusions often found parts of his diagnosis difficult to dismiss. The factory system had indeed created wealth while concentrating ownership, and laborers had indeed become vulnerable to decisions made far above their heads. So the search for fairness entered a sharper stage. It was no longer only about easing hardship within capitalism, but about asking whether the system itself was producing hardship as naturally as it produced goods. Not everyone who saw injustice in industrial society wanted revolution. Many workers, reformers, clergy, and politicians sought something slower and more practical. The building of counterweights inside the system so that those with little property might still gain some dignity, security, and voice. This was the world of trade unions, friendly societies, cooperatives, and labor parties. In Britain, workers organized to demand shorter hours, safer conditions, and better pay. In Germany, labor movements became increasingly disciplined political forces. In the United States, strikes rose and fell in waves, sometimes winning concessions, sometimes meeting violent resistance. Before modern welfare states existed, mutual aid mattered enormously. Workers joined friendly societies that helped cover sickness, funerals, or periods of hardship. And these institutions revealed a simple truth. When markets leave individuals exposed, people often try to create their own forms of insurance through solidarity. The cooperative movement offered another path. In 1844, the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers in northern England, a small group of weavers and artisans, created rules for a consumer cooperative that emphasized fair dealing, shared ownership, and the return of surplus to members. Their experiment was modest, but its symbolism was large. It suggested that ordinary people did not have to choose only between isolated market dependence and total state control. They could also build institutions owned collectively and governed for mutual benefit. At the same time, governments began to respond, though unevenly and often reluctantly. Factory acts in Britain gradually restricted child labor and limited some working hours, showing that even the birthplace of industrial capitalism had begun to accept that markets required moral and legal boundaries. In Germany, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, no socialist himself, introduced social insurance in the 1880s, including health insurance, accident insurance, and old age support. His motives were mixed, partly humane, partly strategic, but the result was historic. One of the earliest recognitions by a major state that industrial society could not remain stable if workers were left completely alone against risk. These reforms carried an important lesson. Fairness does not always arrive through one decisive rupture. Sometimes it arrives through accumulated pressure, organization, negotiation, and law. For SleepWise tonight, that matters, because the story is not only about rival systems, but about all the intermediate layers societies build between wealth and vulnerability. A union hall, a cooperative store, a pension fund, a safety regulation, a weekend won after long struggle, these became part of the modern search for fairness. And in this quieter reformist tradition, we begin to see the outlines of mixed economies long before that phrase was widely used. Even so, for many observers, reform did not seem sufficient. If railways, mines, steel mills, docks, and utilities were so essential to national life, why, they asked, should such systems be governed mainly by private profit rather than public purpose? This question did not arise only in revolutionary circles. It emerged from very practical concerns, because some industries were so large, networked, and foundational that competition alone did not always produce results people considered fair or efficient. A railway system, for example, was not like a market stall selling fruit. It required massive fixed investment, long tracks crossing regions, coordinated schedules, and rules about access, pricing, and maintenance, which meant that whoever controlled it could shape the wider economy. The same was true in different ways for coal, steel, water, electricity, and urban transport. These sectors touched daily life so directly that many reformers concluded they should not be left entirely to owners whose first obligation was to shareholders rather than citizens. This was one reason municipal socialism took root in parts of Europe. City governments began taking greater responsibility for gas, water, transit, and sanitation, not because every mayor had embraced a sweeping ideology, but because the practical demands of urban life made some services feel closer to public goods than ordinary commodities. By the early 20th century, state ownership and public planning had therefore become plausible, not merely utopian ideas. If a city could run water, why not transit? If a nation could regulate railroads, why not own parts of the network outright? Supporters believed public ownership could reduce exploitation, expand access, and align major industries with social needs rather than private gain. Critics warned that state control could become slow, political, and unresponsive, replacing one concentration of power with another. Both concerns would prove important. Still, the popularity of public ownership tells us something revealing about the age. Many people had concluded that fairness required more than better wages within the same structure. They wanted a deeper change in who owned the commanding heights of the economy. To them, the issue was not only what workers earned, but who ultimately made decisions about production, investment, prices, and distribution. That distinction matters. A society may soften capitalism through regulation, or it may go further and ask whether key assets themselves should belong to the public. In the years ahead, that question would move from municipal councils and party pamphlets into the center of world history. And once it did, the search for fairness would no longer be a matter only of reforming industrial life. It would become an attempt, in some places, to redesign the whole economy from the top down. The first state built explicitly in the name of socialism emerged not in a wealthy industrial democracy, but in an empire exhausted by war, inequality, and political collapse. Russia, in the early 20th century, was still marked by deep rural poverty, weak institutions, and the long legacy of autocracy even after serfdom had been abolished in 1861. Industrialization had come, but unevenly. St. Petersburg and Moscow contained major factories and concentrated workers, while vast stretches of the empire remained agrarian, poor, and politically brittle. Then came World War I, and with it military disaster, food shortages, inflation, and an erosion of public trust so severe that the old order began to crack. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was therefore not just an ideological event, it was also the explosion of a society under immense material strain. For the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, capitalism and landlordism had failed, and a new order based on collective ownership and worker power seemed both morally necessary and historically inevitable. Factories, banks, and land would be taken from old elites, and a planned economy would, in theory, direct resources toward shared social goals instead of private profit. To millions watching from afar, especially in societies marked by severe class divisions, this was electrifying. Here was a regime claiming to abolish exploitation at its root, to replace inherited privilege with collective purpose, and to reorganize economic life around workers and peasants rather than aristocrats and capitalists. Yet the practical difficulties were immense from the beginning. Civil war, foreign intervention, administrative weakness, and economic dislocation made the early Soviet years chaotic, and the dream of a fair economy was immediately entangled with coercion, shortages, and state violence. Policies, later known as war communism, placed production and food distribution under emergency control. When famine, unrest, and collapse deepened, Lenin temporarily loosened parts of the system through the new economic policy, allowing some private trade to return, which revealed how difficult pure planning could be, even for a revolutionary state. Even so, the Soviet project mattered far beyond its borders. It gave socialism a state, a flag, institutions, and a global reference point, turning what had been a powerful critique into an actual governing system. That transformation changed the 20th century. From this point onward, the debate between capitalism and socialism would no longer be confined to books and parties. It would be measured against factories, harvests, living standards, and human costs. And that is where the next lessons begin. Because once a society attempts to plan an economy at scale, ideals meet logistics, incentives, information, and power. History becomes more concrete, and fairness becomes harder to define than anyone first hoped. Once the Soviet Union survived its earliest turmoil, it began trying to do something no society had ever attempted on such scale: to organize a vast modern economy through plans, quotas, ministries, and state ownership, and to do so in the name of collective progress rather than private profit. The Goel-Roe electrification plan aimed to bring power across a largely rural country, and in the decades that followed, the Soviet state pushed steel output, machine building, rail capacity, and heavy industry with a force that astonished admirers and frightened rivals. Factories rose in places that had once been little more than remote settlements. Magnitogorsk became one emblem of the Stalin era, while the Dnieper hydroelectric station symbolized the belief that planning could compress decades of development into a single generation. From one angle, this looked like proof that markets were not the only way to industrialize. A poor agrarian empire had been turned into a formidable industrial power, able eventually to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and machinery at astonishing scale. The Soviet system also excelled at mobilization. When leaders decided that coal, steel, armaments, or rail production mattered most, resources could be redirected quickly because the state did not have to wait for private incentives to align. But the same features that gave planning its force also produced chronic weaknesses. A ministry in Moscow might know how much steel it wished to produce, yet have far less clarity about which shoes people needed, what goods households preferred, or which quality problems were hidden beneath reported output. This became one of the deepest practical problems of socialism and power: information. Prices in market economies, for all their flaws, carry signals about scarcity, while planned economies often struggle to gather equivalent knowledge across millions of decisions. As a result, output could look impressive while daily life remained awkward and thin. A factory might meet its quota by producing the right tonnage of nails, but in the wrong sizes. A shop might have shelves full of one poor quality good and none of another. Families might secure bread, yet still spend hours navigating shortages. Housing, employment, and basic education could be more guaranteed than in harsher capitalist environments, and many citizens gained literacy and industrial skills unimaginable in the old czarist world. Yet the human cost of forced collectivization, purges, coercion, and repression was immense. The search for fairness had not abolished power. It had concentrated it differently. So here, history offered one of its durable lessons. An economy can be organized toward common goals and even achieve remarkable feats. But once decision-making rises too far from ordinary life, fairness may be promised in theory, while frustration accumulates in practice. If socialism was learning the burdens of planning, capitalism soon faced its own crisis of confidence. In 1929, the American stock market crashed, but the deeper shock was not the fall itself. It was the unraveling that followed as banks failed, credit contracted, firms collapsed, and unemployment spread through entire communities. The Great Depression moved from finance into kitchens, farms, and factory towns. In the United States, unemployment reached roughly a quarter of the workforce at its peak. Bread lines lengthened, savings disappeared with failed banks, and families who had done nothing reckless found themselves ruined by forces far beyond their control. The crisis did not stay American. Germany, Britain, and much of the wider world felt the contraction because modern capitalism was already linked through trade, credit, and falling demand. For many observers, this was a devastating question for defenders of markets. If capitalism was supposed to coordinate society efficiently, why had it delivered idle factories, unsold goods, and millions of willing workers unable to find work? President Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not abolish capitalism, but he did reshape its boundaries. Through the New Deal, the American state expanded its role in stabilizing finance, regulating parts of the economy, and building a modest floor beneath citizens who had been left too exposed. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men to plant trees, build trails, and restore public lands. The Works Progress Administration funded roads, schools, bridges, airports, libraries, and other public works, leaving behind infrastructure and a memory that government could also build. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electrification and regional development to a poorer part of the country. Social Security, established in 1935, created old age pensions and unemployment insurance, quietly changing what millions of Americans could expect from society in times of vulnerability. Reform also reached finance. Glass-Steagall separated parts of banking activity, while deposit insurance helped restore public trust that savings would not simply vanish when panic moved faster than facts. The New Deal did not end the Depression on its own, and historians still debate which programs mattered most. But its broader significance is clear. A leading capitalist society had concluded that markets could generate wealth, yet still failed disastrously in providing stability and protection. This mattered far beyond Washington. Across the industrial world, the Depression weakened faith that economic life could be safely left to self-correct. So, another lesson entered the story. Capitalism survived, but not unchanged, because once a society sees mass insecurity up close, it rarely returns with innocence to the assumption that markets alone will take care of everyone. It was in this atmosphere that John Maynard Keynes became so influential, not because he promised a perfect system, but because he offered a way of thinking about why modern economies could remain weak for long stretches, even when people still wanted to work, spend, and build. Keynes argued that economies are not always self-healing in the short run. When fear spreads, households cut spending, businesses cancel investment, banks grow cautious, and governments that also retreat can deepen the very slump they hope to endure quietly. This insight sounds simple now, but it was a major shift. It suggested that unemployment on a mass scale was not always a moral failure. It could be the result of inadequate demand moving through the whole system like cold through a house. For Keynes, the state therefore had a role not only in writing rules, but in steadying the cycle. Public spending during downturns could support incomes, maintain employment, and prevent a crisis from becoming self-reinforcing. This did not mean abolishing markets. It meant accepting that a capitalist society might need public institutions strong enough to lean against panic, cushion shocks, and preserve social legitimacy when private confidence collapses. You can see the appeal of this middle path. It kept private ownership, entrepreneurship, and price signals, yet admitted that human communities cannot be treated as experiments in permanent austerity, while waiting for invisible adjustments to arrive. Over time, this way of thinking helped support a wider architecture of protections. Central banks became more active in managing downturns. Governments accepted a larger responsibility for employment and stabilization. And what later came to be called automatic stabilizers, such as unemployment benefits and progressive taxes, were understood as ways to soften recessions. The influence stretched beyond crisis response. The Bretton Woods system, shaped in the 1940s, reflected a broader ambition to create a more stable international order after depression and war. In this quieter chapter of the story, fairness becomes less about choosing one grand ideology over another, and more about building mechanisms that prevent ordinary people from being crushed by volatility. A job lost in a downturn, a farm hit by falling prices, a family unable to pay rent. These are not abstractions. Critics would later argue that governments can overspend, misallocate capital, or become too confident in fine-tuning complex economies. Those criticisms matter. But Keynes left a modest and profound lesson. A decent society may still rely on markets, yet refuse to believe that suffering during a slump is somehow cleansing by itself, or that fairness means asking the vulnerable to wait patiently while systems repair their own mathematics. After the Second World War, much of Western Europe began constructing something that neither classical capitalism nor revolutionary socialism had fully delivered: a social settlement in which markets would generate growth, but the state would guarantee a larger measure of security, health, education, and dignity. In Britain, the war had strengthened the case for collective provision. The Beveridge Report of 1942 identified what it called 5 giant evils: want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. And after the war, governments moved to confront them through institutions meant to last beyond a single emergency. The National Health Service, founded in 1948, became one of the clearest examples. Health care would be funded publicly and available according to need rather than wealth. A simple idea that changed the meaning of citizenship. In Sweden and the wider Nordic world, social democracy developed along somewhat different lines, but with a similar spirit. Strong unions, broad taxation, public services, and negotiated compromise between labor and business helped produce societies that remained capitalist, yet were far more deliberate about reducing insecurity. West Germany built the social market economy. It preserved competition and private enterprise, but paired them with social insurance, co-determination in some industries, and a larger acceptance that prosperity should be widely shared if democracy itself was to remain stable and trusted. This post-war model did not eliminate inequality, and it rested on favorable conditions that would not always endure: rapid growth, younger populations, and industrial strength. Even so, it changed expectations in powerful ways. A worker in post-war Europe could increasingly imagine a life in which illness would not automatically mean destitution, Old age would not depend entirely on family savings, and education might carry children into opportunities their grandparents never had. That was not equality in the pure socialist sense, but it was a profound revision of capitalism's harsher 19th century form. The built environment reflected these choices. Public housing, expanded universities, transit networks, family benefits, and pension systems became reminders that societies were trying to distribute stability across a lifetime. Of course, there were trade-offs. High taxes could become politically contentious. Bureaucracies could grow heavy, and some public industries proved slow to adapt. Still, post-war Europe offered one of the strongest historical arguments for blending systems rather than worshiping purity. It suggested that markets are often better at generating dynamism, while democratic states can spread risk and widen access. In that sense, fairness became something calmer and more institutional. Not a slogan, not a revolution, but a set of durable promises built quietly into everyday life. As the 20th century moved deeper into the Cold War, capitalism and socialism came to be judged not only as theories, but as rival civilizations. Each side pointed to its strengths, magnified the other's failures, and tried to persuade the world that it offered the more humane future. The Soviet Union could point to rapid industrialization, military resilience, full employment on paper, and spectacular achievements in science and engineering. When Sputnik entered orbit in 1957, it was not merely a satellite. It was a declaration that a planned socialist state could educate scientists, mobilize resources, and compete at the frontier of modernity. The United States and its capitalist allies offered a different image. Their claim was not only that freedom mattered politically, but that decentralized markets produced a richer everyday life, fuller shop shelves, more consumer choice, greater space for private initiative. These contrasts could be seen in ordinary objects as much as in speeches. Refrigerators, washing machines, automobiles, televisions, packaged foods, and suburban housing all became part of the Cold War story, because abundance was not just statistical. It was visible in kitchens, stores, and family routines. Yet neither side told the whole truth about itself. Capitalist societies often downplayed racial injustice, poverty, labor insecurity, and the fact that consumer plenty could coexist with exclusion and inequality, while socialist states downplayed censorship, repression, chronic shortages. Eastern Bloc citizens often had access to housing, education, and work, but they also learned the rituals of queues, administrative scarcity, and political caution. In the West, citizens enjoyed broader consumption and civil liberties, yet many also depended on welfare supports, unions, public schools. This is one reason the Cold War is so instructive for SleepWise tonight. It reminds us that systems are rarely as pure in life as they are in speeches. American prosperity after 1945 rested partly on markets, but also on infrastructure, mortgage programs, public universities, labor protections, and social insurance. Soviet socialism delivered industrial and scientific strength, but often at the price of centralization so severe that everyday needs and political freedom were consistently subordinated to the state. By the 1970s and 1980s, the contrast had become harder for socialist governments to manage. Growth slowed, consumer shortages became more glaring, and comparison with Western living standards became more painful. So the Cold War did not end with a neat philosophical verdict, but it did leave a strong historical impression. Markets, for all their injustices, proved more adaptive in producing variety and responsive supply, while socialist planning proved better at mobilization than at sustaining freedom and flexibility over the long run. By the late 20th century, no country better illustrated the untidy reality of economic history than China. After the Communist Revolution of 1949, the new state under Mao Zedong sought to reorganize society through collective ownership, rural communes, and state planning. Landlords were dispossessed, major industries came under state control, and private commerce narrowed sharply. For many supporters, this promised a decisive break from foreign domination and the humiliations of a poor agrarian past. Yet, the effort to command such a vast society from above led to immense tragedy as well as deep transformation. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, tried to accelerate industrial and agricultural output through mass mobilization, but unrealistic targets and distorted reporting helped produce one of the worst famines in human history. Later, the Cultural Revolution brought another convulsion, shaking institutions, persecuting intellectuals, and turning politics into a force that could reach into classrooms, factories, and family life. By Mao's death in 1976, China had achieved broader literacy and stronger state capacity, but it also remained poor by world standards. Then came Deng Xiaoping, and with him one of the most consequential pivots in modern history. Without abandoning one-party rule, China began allowing market incentives back into large parts of economic life. Farmers gained more freedom through the household responsibility system. Special economic zones, especially Shenzhen, welcomed investment, export manufacturing, and experimentation that would have seemed ideologically dangerous only a few years earlier. Township and village enterprises multiplied. Later, private firms grew, foreign companies built factories, and hundreds of millions of people moved from countryside to city as China became the workshop of the world. This was not classical capitalism, and it was no longer orthodox socialism either. Major banks remained heavily influenced by the state, strategic sectors stayed under public control, and the Communist Party never surrendered its commanding political role. Yet prices, profit, competition, and private ambition now shape daily life in ways that Maoist planning had sharply restricted. China's rise therefore challenged the old Cold War habit of imagining that societies must choose one pure model and remain inside it forever. Its record is mixed, and that is precisely why it is so revealing. Market reforms helped lift hundreds of millions out of extreme poverty and connect China to global trade, while also bringing inequality, regional imbalances, and a new concentration of wealth. So another lesson enters the story. Societies often evolve not by winning ideological arguments cleanly, but by borrowing whatever seems to work. China did not end the debate between capitalism and socialism. It complicated it, which may be closer to the truth of history anyway. If China showed that socialism could absorb markets, the late 20th century also showed that capitalist societies were growing impatient with the size and confidence of the post-war state. By the 1970s, much of the Western world faced slower growth, rising inflation, labor unrest, and a sense that the old settlement was becoming harder to finance. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 deepened the mood. Energy costs rose, prices climbed, unemployment increased, and governments discovered that the tools that had seemed effective in earlier decades no longer delivered easy stability. Into this atmosphere came a renewed faith in markets. Economists such as Milton Friedman argued that governments had become too interventionist, unions too powerful, regulations too heavy, and public sectors too bloated. In Britain, Margaret Thatcher pushed privatization, weakened union power, and treated competition as a corrective to what she saw as stagnation. In the United States, Ronald Reagan championed deregulation, lower taxes, and a broader belief that private initiative, not public management, was the true engine of prosperity. Airlines were deregulated, state assets were sold, financial markets became more liberalized, and the moral vocabulary of the age shifted. Efficiency, entrepreneurship, flexibility, and shareholder value became more celebrated. There was real force behind this turn. Some nationalized industries were sluggish. Some bureaucracies were costly. And some labor arrangements had grown rigid enough to block adaptation. More competitive markets could lower prices, widen choice, and redirect capital toward more productive uses. Global supply chains and advances in computing reinforced the sense that agile market systems were better suited to a fast-changing world. But the market revival carried its own costs. Deindustrialization hollowed out old factory regions in Britain, the United States, and beyond, leaving communities with weaker job ladders and a lingering memory that efficiency for the nation can feel like abandonment for a town. Finance also became more central. Credit expanded, asset prices rose, and many economies shifted from making things toward managing flows of money, information, and services. This created wealth, but often unevenly. Those who owned homes, stocks, or financial assets could prosper dramatically, while those dependent on wages alone sometimes found that insecurity had returned in a newer and more polished form. So the late 20th century offered another complicated lesson. Too much state control can smother initiative, but too much faith in markets can leave entire regions and classes exposed to forces they did not choose. The search for fairness did not disappear in the age of liberalization. It simply moved again from the factory floor to the housing market, from visible smokestacks to quieter forms of inequality. By the early 21st century, most serious economies had settled into some kind of mixture. Almost nowhere was purely capitalist in the old laissez-faire sense, and almost nowhere remained socialist in the classic centrally planned sense. Instead, countries combined markets, property rights, taxes, welfare systems, public infrastructure, regulations, and social expectations in different proportions. The argument was now about different recipes for blending dynamism with protection. The United States leaned more heavily toward private provision, especially in health care, yet it still relied on Social Security, Medicare, unemployment insurance, public schools, deposit insurance, central banking, and state spending on roads, defense, and research. Germany kept strong industrial firms and private enterprise, but paired them with vocational training, public insurance, worker representation, and a social market tradition. The Nordic countries combined high taxes with broad services, flexible firms with strong safety nets, and some of the world's most open economies with deep public guarantees. Singapore offered another variation, marrying markets, trade openness, and private business with state direction in housing, infrastructure, and strategic planning. Japan and South Korea showed how development could involve private industry, export competition, and strong state guidance all at once. Even countries that speak most confidently about free enterprise depend heavily on legal systems, central banks, public universities, patent protections, utility regulation, and government-built infrastructure. And countries with stronger welfare protection still rely on prices, entrepreneurship, investment, and competition to generate much of the wealth they later redistribute. This is why real economic life resists purity. A vaccine may emerge from private research shaped by patents and profit, then be purchased or supported by public funding. A railway may be built by private contractors, regulated by public authorities, financed through debt markets, and used by citizens who assume it should serve more than a narrow commercial purpose. Modern societies are layered in this way. People may praise self-reliance, yet expect disaster relief, clean water, consumer protections, pensions, and functioning public order. They may distrust bureaucracy, yet depend on building codes, traffic systems, public health agencies, and courts to make daily life livable. So, one of the quieter truths of the modern age is that almost everyone lives inside a mixed economy, even when political language tries to simplify that fact. The real disagreement is often about degree. How much inequality is tolerable? How much risk should be socialized? How progressive should taxes be? And which parts of life should never depend entirely on purchasing power alone? These are not small questions, but they are no longer asked from untouched ideological ground. And here, as the story begins to draw inward, we arrive at the most difficult question of all. What do people actually mean when they say fairness? The word feels simple until it must be turned into budgets, wages, laws, schools, hospitals, and inheritance rules. Some people mean equality of outcome, or something close to it. The hope that large gaps in wealth and comfort should be narrowed because luck, birth, and inherited advantage shape life far more than effort alone. Others mean equality of opportunity, a world in which outcomes may differ greatly, but the starting line is made less cruel through education, health care, safety, and fair rules. Still others think in terms of merit. They accept inequality as long as rewards appear linked to talent, discipline, innovation, or contribution. But even merit is not as clean as it sounds. A brilliant child born into a stable home with books, nutrition, tutors, and safe streets is not beginning in the same world as a brilliant child born into chaos, debt, violence, or neglect. Then there is luck, that quiet force economic systems never fully tame. A person may work hard and still fall ill, be born into the wrong year, lose a job in a downturn, or live in a town whose main employer closes after a strategy meeting far away. Another may inherit property in a rising city and become wealthy through patience more than labor. Fairness, then, becomes tangled with time, place, health, and the simple accident of being born on one side of a line rather than another. Philosophers tried to give these tensions names. John Rawls asked what kind of society people would design if they did not know in advance whether they would be rich or poor, healthy or sick, fortunate or vulnerable. Friedrich Hayek warned against the illusion that anyone could distribute social outcomes neatly without harming freedom and spontaneous order. Amartya Sen later turned attention toward capabilities, asking not only what people possess, but what they are actually able to do and become. These ideas matter because they soften the false neatness of slogans. Fairness is not only about income. It is also about voice, mobility, dignity, time, stability, health, and whether people can recover from bad luck without being permanently broken by it. A society may be rich and still feel unfair if housing, schooling, and political influence are quietly inherited. Another may be more equal and still feel unfair if effort seems detached from reward or if power becomes remote and paternal. So perhaps the search for fairness has always contained several longings at once: to be protected from ruin, to be rewarded for effort, to avoid humiliation, to have some real chance, and to live in a system whose rules do not seem rigged beyond appeal. No formula ends that tension completely, which may be why the debate survives every generation that thinks it has finally settled it. And so, after factories and famines, strikes and welfare states, revolutions and reforms, we arrive not at a final verdict, but at a gentler understanding. Capitalism and socialism were never merely rival economic manuals. They were two large, imperfect answers to a much older human concern. How should people share a world in which effort is unequal, luck is uneven, power accumulates, and need never disappears entirely? Each system saw something real. Capitalism understood that freedom, prices, enterprise, and competition can release extraordinary energy. It helps explain why innovation often flourishes where people are allowed to build, risk, fail, try again, and keep part of what they create. Socialism understood that unguarded markets do not naturally protect the weak, dignify every worker, or soften every misfortune. It helps explain why people kept asking for unions, pensions, public schools, health care, labor law, public housing, and safety nets, even in societies that celebrated private success. History showed the strengths of both visions, but also their limits. Capitalism could generate abundance and still leave many lives precarious, while socialism could promise security and still become rigid, coercive, and distant from ordinary desire. Again and again, real societies borrowed from each side. They regulated markets, then deregulated them. They expanded welfare, then retrenched it. They privatized industries, then rescued banks. They praised self-reliance, then turned to the state in crisis. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. Fairness is not a machine that can be installed once and left to run. It is a moving balance between liberty and protection, incentive and solidarity, innovation and restraint. It must be adjusted because prosperity without dignity eventually feels hollow, while equality without freedom eventually feels severe. Tonight, we have wandered through ports and mills, parliaments and ministries, planned cities, and market streets. We have seen that the search for fairness did not begin with any manifesto, and it will not end with any slogan. It continues wherever parents worry about their children's chances, wherever workers ask what they are owed, wherever citizens debate what should belong to the market and what should remain beyond it. It continues in tax codes, school systems, and the price of bread. And perhaps that is why this story never truly grows old. Every generation inherits the same question in slightly different clothing. How to be productive without becoming cruel. How to be secure without becoming stagnant. And how to build a society that feels more humane than the one before it. The world slows, and so do we. And in that slowing, perhaps fairness looks less like victory and more like care. A long, unfinished attempt to make room for ambition, vulnerability, and dignity in the same shared night.